So I think you're going to see a number of talks today that continue to drill down in detail on how these environmental principles are going to work. But before I start, I want to say a couple things. The first is that John did a good job of acknowledging my colleagues on the CLC and the work that they've done to bring this forward. But I think it's important to acknowledge the work that GLFC has done, particularly John and Roger Knight, to move this initiative forward, because it does provide us. So John talked a bit at the end of his presentation about moving from strategic to tactical. This is the entire document. So I'm showing you on Edge because it's actually a pretty focused document that provides some really good guidance on how to move from that strategic level at the environmental objectives level down to practitioners on the ground. And I think that's very important because we see lots of high-level priority setting work across the Great Lakes, but getting down to this level, you don't often see. So I think kudos to the folks on CLC that did that. So, over the past 30 years, we've successfully developed and implemented cooperative fisheries management throughout the Great Lakes Basin. Unmanaged, how close do I have to be to that? Unmanaged fishery exploitation is no longer a significant threat to fish stocks in the basin. Where we haven't been as successful is in protecting or improving important habitats that are necessary for sustainable fish production. So I'm going to offer a bit of a perspective on why our efforts in the habitat arena have not been successful and how this set of guiding principles is going to help us be more successful. So lots of people live in the Great Lakes Basin, and this has created huge stresses on watersheds as they've been altered to meet modern human needs. We've used up valuable land and water that provide ecosystem goods and services, and we have competing uses for our watersheds. So we're using water for everything from irrigation to hydroelectric generation. This has created huge stresses on watersheds and resulted in things like poor water quality, fragmented habitat, and things like harmful algal blooms. These are huge issues with no easy solutions. We've been wrestling with this for decades as a broader Great Lakes community, and it's something we need to move forward on. Addressing fish habitat has been the elephant in the room for fish managers, and it's a tough beast to wrestle. This is because we have a lack of a perfect understanding on how to protect or improve habitat. And this lack of perfect understanding is often compounded by harmful invasive species and wildcards like climate change as well. Even if we always know exactly what needs to be done, fish managers lack authority, as John had said, over levers like land use planning and water quality management. Another issue is whether we can enact changes at relevant scales with enough resources to be effective. Moreover, most of the impediments to fish production haven't happened overnight. There's been a slow creep, and this has created a low sense of urgency on how to address them and when. And lastly, and I think very importantly, there are a number of competing issues on the landscape. For example, dam removals may restore habitat, but might create habitat for AIS, such as sea lamprey. And widely applied phosphorus programs may work to mitigate harmful algal blooms, but they may cause nearshore fish productivity issues in oligotrophic systems. Further, limiting phosphorus can really require unpopular regulations in the agricultural industry. So there are a lot of really interesting competing interests there. Now, on the plus side, within the fisheries management community, we're really good at working together. We've been working together as Lake Committee since 1965 with a commitment to common goals under the Joint Strategic Plan since 1981. And the Joint Strategic Plan also connects fisheries managers to other environmental managers, specifically water quality through the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, all within an ecosystem management strategy and related procedures. We heard about how the Joint Strategic Plan calls for the development of fish community goals and objectives, and we have environmental objectives to support those on 3 lakes. So while the joint strategic plan has been useful on many fronts, we do need to do more to tackle the habitat constraints on fish production. So the question is how? Recently, the CLC has developed a set of these focused environmental principles to provide consistent guidance to those who can protect or improve fish habitat in the basin. And John said it well, that's not always us, and quite often it's not often us. Sometimes it is, where we do habitat restoration efforts, and Eric Weimer talked about it in the Lake Erie session today, for example. But quite often, it's NGOs or other partners that we really rely on and need to influence in how they move forward with environmental protection. So the premise of these environmental principles is that the fish community goals and objectives can be met more effectively across the basin if critical functional habitats are identified, protected, or improved in each lake through a systematic, adaptive, and cumulative and collaborative approach that accommodates fisheries value in decisions to act on manageable anthropogenic stresses. And that's an important thing, manageable anthropogenic stresses. We need to work on those things that we can work on and affect change in, and really focus and drill down on those. So what is a functional habitat? The key concept is that a functional habitat is a system of connected habitats needed to support desired fish production as called for in the FCOs, the Fish Community Goals and Objectives. And a way of thinking about them is that they support life cycles for discrete stocks of fish. And you can see here, we're talking about a whole life cycle of fish. So spawning, egg survival, larval growth, juvenile growth and survival, and back to spawning, or adult growth and survival and back to spawning. So we need to ensure that for fish stocks we have all those habitat functions provided for. Designation of a functional habitat by a lake committee is our way of placing a high priority on areas in that defined system. And so that can be a subsystem in a lake, like, for example, scutters, or in a whole lake. Within functional habitats, so within a lake we have these functional habitats, so a river system, a reef complex, a coastal wetland. When they intersect and come together, we also find that we have high priority areas within them. So where these things are integrated or linked, we find areas that become at a higher level of priority than, well, not a higher level of priority, but they create ideas for focused action, and we call those priority management areas. So these are areas of overlap between and among functional habitats that could help us focus short-term priorities in specific locations. So if we flip back to the key habitats, these are key habitats across the entire Great Lakes Basin that lake committees have already identified through their fish community goals and objectives as important to fish production. So it's no secret or no surprise, I guess, that many of these are high energy systems like rivers that provide huge benefit to fish populations, or important nursery areas and spawning areas that you see in these embayments. So I don't think we've left too many important areas off this map, and that's one of the problems, is we've said a lot about what's important, but trying to make priorities and set priorities across this vast landscape of functional important habitats becomes the challenge. The environmental principles also guide lake committees to define terms and prioritize general types of actions, and John went over this a little bit, and it's important for us to use a common language when we are moving forward in these things. So, for example, protect is to guard against impairments, and improving habitat is to restore an unimpaired condition and to enhance to a less impaired condition. Examples of that are there. So to protect would be to prevent AIS establishment in an area. To restore could mean barrier removal or eradication of AIS. And to enhance would be to reshape bathymetry, or, for example, some of the work done in scutters on sturgeon habitat. We're moving forward actively by putting in spawning habitat into the system to enhance and increase fish production in that area. One of the key components of this work moving forward is the adaptive management nature of the work. So what is that? Before doing work, it's important to establish in this framework a working hypothesis. And this one is a specific, and Jeff will get into it, I think, in more detail soon in the next talk. But a working hypothesis in the case of a dam removal, like the Ballville Dam, would be, if the Ballville Dam is removed, then recruitment to the Sandusky River walleye stock will increase. Well, why would that be true? Well, it's because these expected outcomes will be met. So these are very explicit outcomes that we would link to any actions we would do to improve habitat. So the outcomes would be adult walleye spawning in areas above the Ballville Dam. They now have access to it. Substrate quality would improve because of changes in flow regimes in the river. And then we would see larval production from the Sandusky River increasing. So by developing this hypothesis up front and explicitly identifying what the outcomes are supposed to be, we can achieve or understand our success, but also learn when we don't achieve success, right? And many of these things can have sub-hypotheses in them as well. And again, Eric Weimer's work, I'll point to that again, where we've done some wetland restoration in Lake Erie, and we're assessing the impact on fish movement and fish using the new habitat created by that wetland improvement. Another key component of this, the environmental principles, is incorporating the notion of fisheries values in how we set these priorities. So we need to link where and how we do work to what the stakeholder requirements are and what benefits are being provided by those fisheries. And of course, we're a fisheries management agency. This is going to be our key focus. One thing that'll be important, though, is moving forward, we often understand the overall value of fisheries on a lake-wide basis, but we don't understand them at the level of a priority management area. So this will be an area of growth for us moving forward. Also important is working at the appropriate scale of influence. So we obviously have large-scale issues affecting lakes at a basin-wide level. We also have we have to take into account, though, that we can only take action at a lower level of scale. So we use that higher level strategic work, so the Great Lakes Fish Commission Strategic Plan, for example, or other influencing documents like the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement to guide that higher level strategic plan. And as we work through the environmental principles, apply them to our environmental objectives at a lake-specific basis, we can get down to how we're going to and where we're going to prioritize these priority management actions, and then move that out to applicators. And applicators are going to be those groups. They could be us, for example, or they could be NGOs that want to affect change, and we can provide them with the guidance to affect that change through this. So working at scale and utilizing stakeholder input will ultimately help us to focus where we're going to move our efforts for habitat restoration or protection. And you can see that here. And these are examples only of where we might begin focusing all of our efforts or more of our efforts on areas of the appropriate scale, the appropriate value, and the appropriate reaction to our actions. So can we work with the anthropogenic stressors at the appropriate scale? Are these areas important to the resource? Are they important to the stakeholders? That's how we would come about prioritizing these things. So in summary, and I've just got a few more minutes, there's no right approach that will quickly allow us to better protect or improve fish habitat in the Great Lakes. And because of the complexity that we've seen, it's no wonder that we're not there. The Joint Strategic Plan does commit and guide us to working with other managers by identifying our objectives and identifying environmental impediments to achieving them. We have FCOs for all the lakes, and we have environmental objectives for 3 lakes. And these identify important needs and priorities of fisheries managers. But alone, they've not been sufficient to achieve desired results. The development of these environmental principles is intended to help the lake committees better define key priorities for implementation by a suite of applicators through a framework that calls for the approaches I've outlined. But the buck doesn't stop here. We recognize that the applicators will likely not benefit by having more documents that describe fisheries management interests, and that's where I come back to my original notion of a streamlined and tight document providing guidance. Instead, communicating a few priorities for short-term attention and focused priority attention by the right applicators at the right places in each lake is needed, and again, this will help us get there. Ultimately, an emphasis on the development of working relationships between specific fisheries, management agencies, and key applicators will be needed to move forward and improve fish habitat in each lake. That's all I have.